thank you. Welcome to my guests.
Yep.
I know you're described as seasoned journalists. That always means you're kind of the oldest people in the room. So, very welcome. There's an awful lot of noise around the debate that we're going to have now. So what we've done here is put a little bit of structure so that we'll have even time for both sides of our debate today about whether tech platforms have too much power and influence over journalism. A couple of introductions. First of all, the gentleman beside me. First of all, I can introduce Joe Kahn. Joe is managing editor of the New York Times since last year. Before that, international editor for the newspaper, seasoned reporter in Asia. And I know somebody right now who's on the front line of the response of the biggest quality news organizations to a revolution in the way journalism is consumed and distributed. On my left, Quentin Hardy. Quentin is head of editorial at Google Cloud, but don't let that tech label fool you. This is a man with journalism running through his veins, and I believe family, 3 generations of a journalist. Third generation journalist, someone who's worked also with the New York Times before his current position, but also for Forbes. Also, I think, reported not only on technology, but I believe Asia as well, and also has lectured in some of the most prestigious schools and colleges in the United States about information and journalism. 2 people who know what they're talking about. Before I go any further, who here believes that tech platforms have too much influence over news and journalism?
I see a couple. Okay.
Who here believes they don't have too much influence over news and journalism? Okay.
Fewer.
At least 2 people.
I got a sandbag.
Can I just ask you to think about it this way? It's complicated. And I'll tell you why. My story is that I was a journalist for 25 years. My first story, I used a mobile phone the size of a suitcase. That was high tech back in 1990 when I started out. I was absolutely enthralled by the arrival of social media. I was a war correspondent, a foreign correspondent, and for me the arrival of a platform like Twitter changed everything. I went on to become an entrepreneur. I founded a social news agency called Storyful, and then I went to work for Twitter. So I have a complicated view because I believe that we're living through not just one revolution, but 3 revolutions in the way that news is both produced, because obviously now all you have to do to get a mass audience is to have a smartphone in the right place and a connection to a social network. It's revolutionized the way it's consumed. We can consume news at the time of our choosing, at the device of our choosing. We don't sit down and watch the news at night when they tell us. Finally, a revolution. The most troublesome, I think, problematic aspect, the revolution in the way that news is distributed. Now, the social platforms particularly, but the tech platforms, are the most efficient, the largest, and the dominant news platforms in our age, which causes all kinds of complications. So think about the benefits to humanity by having a democratized media where the voices of people on the streets of places like Cairo during the Arab Spring are heard in an authentic, raw way. But also then think about the complication of news owned by platforms that never intended and were never built to be news distribution platforms. I'm going to stop there because there's people who know a lot more about this than I do. I just want to keep open minds in the room, and I'll come back to you at the end to ask you the same questions again. Through no scientific order, I think Quentin, because we know that the people in the audience have a bit of persuading.
I got a few hands against me here, so.
I'm going to give you 5 minutes to speak against.
Okay, I'm going to talk fast then. First, a disclaimer, I do not work in the consumer side, I do not work in the search side, I do not work in the Google News side of Google. I am pursuing analytic journalism inside Google Cloud. Cloud computing is part of what I would say is the most important, not just technology, but cultural and political and social influence of our time. I'll get into that in just a minute. But that disclaimer said, yes, I'm 3rd generation. My grandfathers, one owned a small newspaper, one was the AP congressional correspondent. My father was at Life magazine, and I was at several newspapers, as you heard. To the debate. We are talking about whether tech companies have too much influence in media or power. I would submit that the language of the question is broken, and that's the most interesting thing we can talk about. Because when you think about too much power in news, you think about a press baron, you think about William Randolph Hearst, or a Robert Maxwell, one of these people who's actually interested in steering this point of view, who wants to pursue a certain agenda to create the Spanish-American War or to have tax policy structured a certain way. And I don't think anyone thinks that the heads of these companies has such a news agenda in mind. That limit of the language, that brokenness of the language, is reflected more and more in the way we see the world right now. For example, it's pretty easy to think you've never been so empowered by technology, you've never been more subject to surveillance and manipulation by technology. You've never had more information, you've never been more confused. These are what I call barbell words that we use to describe the world. And the information there is not any particular word. It's that tension, because life is not extremes. Life is middles. We are using these extreme languages, these extreme words, because we're in a space we don't know how to describe yet. So we're feeling the extremes of it right now, and we're finding our way in this landscape. And this is a very troubling thing. You even see it, I would submit, in this conference, when Stephen Hawking, admittedly a far smarter person than me, gets up and talks about how AI may develop a will. There is no evidence that this will happen. There is no evidence that Skynet is coming, but we conceive of this for various reasons because so many changes are happening so fast, and we ascribe this ultimate end to them. Let's set that aside for a moment and concentrate on the fact that we're in this moment of a kind of heuristic confusion about how we describe the world. The good news is this has happened before, and usually around media. If you look at the printing press, it gave rise to a consciousness of vernacular language that had never existed before, and an empowerment of the bourgeoisie to educate itself in a way that had never happened before. It's no wonder that the first best-selling author was Martin Luther, a translator, essentially, of the Bible, who reset the relationship of many to themselves and God. Or in the 19th century, the media of telegraphy and photography and all the new forms of information coming gave a kind of immediacy to life that it hadn't had before. And if you look at the history of photography, it reset how we understood war, for example. If you look at the way Brady portrays the Civil War at the beginning and then at the end, there's this new understanding of the life of the common man that Jacob Riis then leveraged for social change. And the act of depicting things on that level changed the way people thought about their fellow man. Now, my own father at Life magazine was beset by a technology change when television came along and replaced photography as a news medium, and that pretty much took out the old Life as a news thing. I think what's going on now is something like that. And what's happening is through smartphones and sensors and the Internet of Things with very large, complex cloud computing systems, we are putting a nearly infinite amount of computation to every point on the world. This will be fantastic because all art and science and commerce are based on pattern finding, and the true AI is essentially statistical pattern finding software that will lead to more creation and more discovery and more understanding than we've ever had before. It's extremely exciting, but it does dislodge things along the way, as has happened before. In the case of the news business, newspapers had control of time and space for information. The New York Times, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, daily newspapers controlling the information you got in that space. So if you had a department store was going to have a sale on a Saturday, you had to advertise in that Minneapolis paper on Wednesday for that sale. If you had looking for a job, selling a car, you needed classifieds. Well, the internet wiped out that control of time and space. Fine papers like Joe's, where I used to work as well, have found new ways to survive in a new economic model. Others have suffered, and that's difficult. Now, the new model, I would argue, involves subscriptions, which is in fact the payment for a relationship with a news provider you believe is true. I went to the New York Times because I believed in the subscription model. How much time do I have left here?
You've got about a minute and a half.
I've got about a minute and a half. Okay, I believed in the subscription model. I think the advent of, say, what's called fake news, and Joe just gave a very good panel on this, is a bump along the way as we define how people understand what truth might be in the future and how we define truth. We didn't used to have to worry about certain things in our literacy that we have to worry about now. It's a new kind of learning. There was a literacy in the brand of the New York Times that people believed in generally, and a kind of mutual agreement about what truth was. That started to fragment far before the internet with talk radio and newsletters and the rise of, the disappearance of the 1987 Equal Time Act in politics has been edging away. These vectors got into the idea of personalized information that could have heavy bias. It's now been leveraged by this new technology, but we're finding ways to counteract that. For example, when people subscribe to the New York Times, they are choosing to buy vetted news, and that turns out to be an extremely successful model for Joe and his company.
Quentin, thank you. We'll come back for some closing remarks, but the mention of the New York Times, the man himself here, Joe Kahn, you've got 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the premise or the question that was asked to frame this debate is not that difficult to answer, and I think that is reflected by the show of hands in the room. There's really no question that tech platforms, social media platforms, have far more influence over the news than even they anticipated and have any idea how to manage. The basic business model of Facebook and Google and Twitter is to aggregate all kinds of content, including news content, but not limited to it, and then aggregate all kinds of demand for that content. And the most successful among them, Google and Facebook, are extremely effective aggregation engines for everything, from advertising to fraudulent content to social media sharing, and a distribution platform for some of the best publishers and broadcasters in the world. And their business model is extremely strong because they have an excellent user experience and because they can gather together, essentially as a sharing platform, the most fantastical amounts of news and information that anybody could have imagined, and no one could have imagined back, as Quentin refers to, in the William Randolph Hearst era of the yellow press. None of these platforms have really thought through in any kind of a systematic way what to do with the power that they've essentially aggregated to themselves. They're only at the very beginning stages of even deciding whether or not they have the responsibility to exercise some kind of scrutiny of the content that they gather. And we're hearing very different things from different companies involved in this as to whether, in the aftermath of the 2016 election in the United States and clear evidence of some bad actors using these, using search or using social media to have influence on elections in the UK, the Brexit referendum, or in several different elections that occurred in the EU, whether or not they begin to have responsibility for keeping their platforms free of this kind of fraudulent news, fake news, blatant interference in democratic politics. There's some rhetorical acknowledgement that they might, but the actual mechanism for policing an unimaginable amount of data that's created literally every hour is so far beyond the capacity of these tech platforms that even philosophically, there's really a debate about whether they can or should begin to police this. The ultimate question is whether these tech platforms are really giant utilities, which ought to be fairly neutral in terms of the way all kinds of users use them. Advertisers, users themselves, publishers, and even, yes, those who go on there with nefarious or malicious purposes. Once they begin to take responsibility for the content that circulates on the platform, they're beginning to inch their way toward being not totally unlike the New York Times, a publisher or a broadcaster or a media company that actually does have responsibility for what you publish and what you circulate, on your platform or under the name of your brand. And it's not clear to me that Google or Facebook is anywhere close to really fundamentally wrestling with that existential question. Because the media, the moment they begin to define themselves as having responsibility for this, they potentially open themselves up to regulation. They make it much more difficult for users to get on the platform. They may have to identify themselves more fully than they have in the past. They may have to vet the advertising. Facebook has 5 million advertisers on its platform.
Joe,
Many of them, yeah.
Wrap up. I'm going to bounce that question you're posing there, which is simply this. What about regulation? If we have any doubts, and certainly in Europe there's a massive public sort of pressure for this, we should regulate the platforms to prevent them having that kind of influence. Quentin, how do you respond to that push?
Well, I'm pleased to see that Joe and I are closer together than we thought. There's something important, something has changed. We're in a very new space. And when we speak about regulation, that's a good example. You talk about it being perhaps like giant utilities. But utilities, power companies and water companies, tend to be protected monopolies that tend to have a guaranteed margin of profit, tend to innovate on a very slow level, and tend to have competition controlled. So I'm not sure that's something you particularly care for in these. I mean, inside the Times, you've done fantastic work with virtual reality stories and live stream stories, and you leverage technologies that didn't even exist practically 5 years ago. You don't want to walk away from that.
That even the basic admission by someone like Mark Zuckerberg that he runs a media company is so hard for him to say when it's blindingly obvious that is the biggest news platform in the world today.
I really can't address what Mark Zuckerberg chooses to say to describe himself. I'm trying to take an analytic journalistic approach to the larger phenomenon here. Are the companies being responsive? They testify in front of Congress, in a way I had never seen before.
To clarify, they sent their lawyers to testify in front of Congress.
Their lawyers are employees, Joe.
They're employees.
Mark didn't go, and that makes you unhappy. I can't help that.
No, I don't know, but I think that if Mark was ready to fully embrace the responsibility that he had or that his platform had towards some of the results in the 2016 election, if he had something truly fully formed to say about what he was going to do about it, you'd think that he'd use that platform for himself. I think the reason you send your lawyer is because you're not quite sure of what this whole scary new world means for your business model, and at this point you send a lawyer to try to parse, the questions from Congress.
Joe, do you at
We
least
can parse his motives all we want. The reality is this is a moving target.
And would you accept that for the platforms, these are unintended consequences? It's not like big tobacco, where they knew the risks all along. These are early days for social platforms. They're barely in their teens.
I agree with that, and I think the platforms were essentially built by techno-utopians. I think they actually had extremely ambitious and mostly positive impressions about the effect that these platforms were going to have on society. None of them went into this thinking that they were going to become a forum for Russian interference in the American election. They're somewhat shocked and horrified by it. The question is, now that that's happened, how do these platforms evolve? Do they fundamentally take responsibility, or do they pass responsibility for somebody else to regulate it on their own platform? To what extent do they actually begin to help users sort out high-quality journalistic content from fraudulent news, from nothing but partisan spin, all of which is blurred and mixed together on these platforms?
In this scenario, they can't be globally regulated. They would have to be particular to the regulations of any zone or country.
To that point that there's the techno-utopian, which I think is a phrase that's starting to become very prevalent in journalistic circles. They're not news people, they're not journalists, they don't have generations of journalism in their veins. They're the very worst people to tell us how to respond in this circumstance. That's a point of view I hear a lot from journalists.
I work with the guys. I think they have great intentions. I think they have analytic honesty. I wouldn't have joined them if I didn't think so. I think they're dealing with an extremely knotty problem. They do go to Congress and hear about it. They are not unaware of it. I don't think they like these results. On the other hand, it is difficult to state how you work through this. As I have said, we don't have good language yet. We don't understand the landscape yet. For example, a huge factor in news decisions now is how many clicks a story gets. That virality is a huge issue. And this actually steers news judgment. Donald Trump's tweets have been a godsend to many, many news outlets. You want that click information, though. You wouldn't want that withheld. You wouldn't want to stand back and make analytic judgments. We have to find our way inside this.
Look,
Can I ask you a closing statement,
Yeah,
Joe?
sure.
We're running out of time, so 30 seconds to you and Quentin to close off this debate, ridiculously short as it is.
Okay. I would say that Quentin and I probably agree on the biggest fundamental question, which is that this is uncharted territory. I do think that the tech platforms and the social media platforms in particular have far too much influence at the moment over what enormous numbers, billions of people across the world are reading and consuming that passes as news. But I would agree that we're at the early stages of thinking through, really feeling our way through what kind of steps they need to take, users need to take, possibly also governments need to take to begin to regulate this new world and make sure that the kind of blatant interference and hacking that's occurred on these platforms doesn't affect democracies around the world the way it did in 2016.
Final word.
It's very tempting to think you're at the beginning of things or the end of things, and most of the time you're in the middle of things. We have proceeded into this new landscape, and we do have understanding of it. And I think we'll have new literacy and new language for this very shortly. Something I suspect will happen in news where literacy is concerned is an awareness of the vectors of information. How did this reach me? If it started in a server in Bucharest and was 10 seconds later forwarded by 200 Twitter bots, that has a different quality than when it came from the New York Times. That kind of literacy will be part of information consumption, if you will. And I think we can arrive at this point and be richer for it.
Thank you both, to Joe, to
Just a
Quentin.
moment. Joe, I have a T-shirt for you. Don't be afraid of the future.
There's
Cloud.
one for everyone in the audience, by the way. No, it's not. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Joe and Quentin. Before I finish up, I'm going to ask the same question again. Hopefully some open minds. Who thinks here that tech platforms, social platforms, have too much influence over journalism?
I think
And
I
who
moved 2 people.
thinks the opposite? I hope did we pick up a couple of people? I don't think so. I think we're pretty much the same as we are.
I saw a hand.
We saw definitely a hand there. So that's it. All I would say, I don't want to sum up the guys. I don't have time to sum up, but just to say one thing. Let's stop this mutually exclusive platform versus publisher. My only appeal to you all today, you're at a web summit. We're seeing the most innovative solutions in every walk of life. Let's all go out together to try and bring some of those innovative solutions to bring together platforms and publishers. It's early days. It's too early to tell. You all have a responsibility because you'll be the future of journalism if you seize that challenge. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Quentin.
Thank
and
you.
thank you very much.